Tygerberg Student Representative Council. And thanks to Lebu for the collaboration. It means a lot to be part of this joint venture. My name is Kwanda Nyembe, and I am studying towards an LLB degree with a major in philosophy, and I am the chairperson for the Stellenbosch University Palestinian Solidarity Forum. I will be presenting alongside my fellow colleagues from the society. The vice chair of the society is Shaniae Maharaj. The secretary is Madhia Shabih. Zayd Wookey is our treasurer and also manages our social media accounts. Last but not least is Fadeelah Williams, who is our events coordinator. I shall speak to you briefly about the recent events that have transpired in Palestine, and my colleagues will introduce themselves before they present, shall speak about the historical events that led us to where we are now. I wish to provide you a background as to what prompted the recent scourge of violence in Palestine earlier this year, which caught global attention. So on the 6th of May 2021, there were protests over the anticipated decision of the Israeli Supreme Court that could potentially evict and displace 6 Palestinian families in Sheikh Jarrah. So Sheikh Jarrah is predominantly a Palestinian residential area in East Jerusalem. And Palestinians there do not have titles to their properties, and for this reason, they are susceptible to evictions at the whim of the Israeli authorities. The Palestinians who live in Sheikh Jarrah are descendants of refugees who were expelled from their homes in Jaffa and Haifa in the 1948 Nakba. Nakba meaning a catastrophe, a great catastrophe, of which shall be explained later. So I use the term refugee loosely because the Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah are in fact IDPs, that is the internally displaced persons who have been displaced from their original homelands owing to the atrocious occupation of Palestine, but remain within the country's geographic borders. This also explains why these people do not have title deeds. It is important to note that the situation in Sheikh Jarrah is merely a microcosm of the bigger picture of land insecurity of the Palestinian people in the entire East Jerusalem. It is this frustration that led to the protest on the 6th of May. So following these protests, on the 10th of May, the Israeli forces stormed the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound and fired rubber bullets, tear gas, and sound bombs at Palestinian worshippers. This led to 11 days of war when Hamas retaliated against this aggression by the Israeli-led government. So after 11 days, there was a ceasefire that I shall return to shortly. In the interim, it is not unusual that people would resist whenever their lives and livelihoods are threatened. One thing that I have learned about the Palestinian people through our engagement with them and their history is that they do not portray themselves as saints. And the historical record attests to this submission that they exist today, notwithstanding the variegated attempts to exterminate them, because they are a resilient people. The reality that remains is that Israel enjoys lots of support from many first world countries. It is precisely for this reason that the international community, which owes its allegiance to these first world countries, has failed to condemn the incremental genocide, the settler colonialism, and the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians in the hands of the Israeli-led government. So, On the 21st of May 2021, there was a ceasefire, which was 11 days after the storming of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And this happens when 256 Palestinians have been killed, and 66 of which were children. This happens when 72,000 Palestinians have been displaced owing to the destruction of their homes and other infrastructure. On the other hand, 200 injuries were recorded in Israel and only 13 deaths. So by definition, a ceasefire is an agreement to temporarily suspend arms amid peace talks. No arms were suspended because even to date, the Israeli state continues to kill Palestinians. There are no peace talks. No peace talks are ongoing because the Israeli state still firmly believes in the Zionist project that saw the formation of this state. So this was just a teaser and I shall leave it here. My colleagues who will speak after me shall explicate what is meant by Zionism and how the state of Israel was formed. Importantly, they shall situate the ongoing Nakba or the suffering of the Palestinian people within the historical record. Thank you so much for your time. And now I shall hand over to Fadeelah Williams. Thank you.
Thank you, Kwanda. So my name is Fadeelah Williams. As previously mentioned, I'm the events coordinator for the SUPSF, and today I'm going to be talking about the historical context between 1917 and 1947 within Israel-Palestine, otherwise known as just Palestine and Palestine 48. However, there will be some context moving before 1917 as it is gravely important. All of my data and research will be coming from various Palestinian and UN sources such as Al Jazeera, the UNHCR, and Fadeelah. So between the period of 1799 and 1946, the British Mandate for Palestine laid the groundwork, which is more specifically between 1917 and 1948, laid the real groundwork for a Jewish state in Palestine to become a reality. So the first talks of a homeland, of Palestine as a homeland to Jews, began in 1799 by Napoleon. Could someone please admit the person to the lobby? And then the term Zionist was first coined in 1885 by Theodor Herzl, who later went on to publish Judenstaat, calling for the creation of a Jewish state. Theodor Herzl advertised this, the doctrine of Zionism globally, moving from state to state, and sort of presenting or pitching the idea of a Zionist homeland or a Jewish homeland to various political entities, beginning with the Ottoman Empire, including later the Allied powers such as Italy, Britain, etc. Yeah. Okay, so much of the context of the Palestinian Israeli problem begins within the First World War and is related to specifically the Balfour Declaration. So what is the Balfour Declaration? Sir Arthur James Balfour, the British Foreign Secretary, issued a declaration to a Zionist organization which read as follows. Foreign Office, 2nd November 1917. Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you on behalf of His Majesty's government the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done with major prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights of the political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. So why did the British Foreign Secretary do this? The British Foreign Secretary was aiming to get the support of the Zionist movement in the First World War. However, what was so wrong with this proclamation, aside from the, inherent implication of giving land to another people where a people was already occupied? Well, the land occupied was not Britain's to give. During this time, it was still in the midst of the World War I. The Ottoman Empire had, quote unquote, ruled or owned or ruled whatever the land known today as Palestine, Palestine 48, along with various other areas within the Middle East. And yeah, the World War I was going on, and Britain, a part of the Allied forces, had begun planning a Sorry, seems my connection cut out there. So I'm assuming I cut off in World War I. Yeah, so at this time, the war was not yet won. However, Britain was predicting that it would win the land of the Middle East. However, what should be noted is many years before the Balfour Declaration was made, remember this was made in 1917, so 2 years prior, in 1915 and 1916, Britain had in fact promised the land known as Palestine, as well as other land within the Middle East, such as Syria and Lebanon, to the Arab nation. So assurances were made between Sir Henry McHennan, the British High Commissioner of Egypt, and Sheriff Hussein, who was the Emir of Mecca, to keep Islam's most holy cities within the area and thus allocate the land within the Middle East to the Arab peoples. In these discussions and correspondence, the Sheriff Hussein, Emir of Mecca, unequivocally demanded independence of the Arab countries, specifically in detail as well the boundaries of the territories in question, which clearly did include Palestine. McMahon confirmed that Great Britain is prepared to recognize and support the independence of Arabs in all regions within the limits demanded by Sheriff of Mecca. So at this point, Britain had promised land unequivocally to the Arab nation. So what's tricky in this understanding now is that by the time the Balfour Declaration had come out, the war was nearing its end, and the Arab nation had felt used. However, in response to the Arab peoples and nations' discontent with Britain basically lying, Britain claimed that it had no intention ever of including in its deals the allocation of Palestine to the Arab people, and it was never made so clear. It was only decades later, in the 1960s, when proof was finally found that Britain did go back on its written word and implication that Palestine was rightfully to be given to the Arab nation. However, this time of 1917 to 1947 also include many changes within the actual lived experience of Palestinians. This could be noted in the experience of Palestinians at the hands of immigrating Jewish peoples. between 1917 and the late 1930s, many Palestinians were unhappy with the continued immigration. Oh, I skipped a part. I am so sorry. So yeah, in sorry. So at the time, so even despite the fact that later on in the 1960s, it was proven that Palestine was meant to be allocated to the Arab nation. During 1970, the United Nations, following the dispute, agreed that Britain should establish within Palestine a homeland for Jewish people. And so this is what they done. During just before and during World War II, around 50,000 people, 50,000 Jewish people immigrated into Palestine. And slowly but surely, immigration into Palestine, Jewish immigration into Palestine, increased. What is tricky to note about the experience of Palestinians living in that time is that while the understanding during World War II was that there was a need for a safe haven for the Jewish people, the experience of Palestinians and the rights of Palestinians were being routinely ignored. And this was not something that was born out of circumstance, but something that was indoctrinated within the Zionist dogma. Because within the writings of Theodor Herzl, it was always understood, and within the slogan of the Zionist movement, it was always understood to be establishing within a land with no people. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the slogan, but it goes along the line of establishing within a land without people, a home for a people without land, thus completely ignoring the existence of Palestinians within the land that the Zionists claimed would be their homeland. And this sentiment was continued between 1917 and 1947 as Palestinian peoples continue to be displaced from their homes, their rights continuously ignored, and falling victim to violence at the hand of the Israeli colonizers. Between when was it? 1930. Between 1922 and 1937, 1942, large groups of armed Zionist groups, many large armed Zionist groups planned many attacks against Palestinians, launching a series of general strikes taking place in Palestine in 1936, mass killings of Palestinian leaders such as Adin al-Qassam, a revolutionary leader in Palestine, who was killed who was killed actually by British forces in 1935, and also violent response to the Arab Revolt, which occurred in 1939. Organizations such as Irgun, an armed Zionist group, also launched a series of bombings, such as the bombing of King David Hotel in Jerusalem, killing 91 people in 1946, and the previously mentioned general strikes that took place. The general attacks in Palestine in 1938. So meanwhile, while all of this was happening, the US and the Soviet Union was solidifying relations with Zionist organizations. In 1942, a Zionist conference was held in New York, specifically to solidify the partnership between the US and Zionist organizations. And at the time, progressive and humanist Zionist leaders who in the 1930s, came out and took a stance against the mistreatment of Palestinians within Israel. Anyway, I would like to just share this link here, basically explaining this, if I can get into the chat. Because they noticed there's similarities between the treatment of Palestinians within Palestine and the treatment of the Jewish people in like the anti-Semitic treatment of the Jewish people just globally and historically, especially during the times of World War II. Sorry. There we go. More things happened in 1947, obviously, but I am going to leave that to Shaniae to discuss. Thank you for Kwanda, people without land for land without people, which was the slogan of the Zionist movement.
Thank you, Fadeelah. That was a really great capturing of what happened previous to 1947. So as Fadeelah said, I think what happened with the British Mandate was that we had a contract, in effect, that had inherent contradictions, right? Because on one hand, we have the British who had promised Jews the establishment of a permanent Jewish homeland. And on the other hand, we have a promise to the Palestinian people of independence. And so the outcome of that is that neither promises could be reconciled with each other, and the British administration, quite obviously, didn't know what to do. And so they took that issue to the UN. And then the question kind of becomes, how is the UN going to resolve this mess? And here I think we see really where the Cold War plays out in very insidious ways. And I'll make that explicit as we get into the 3 Arab-Israeli wars that happened from the 50s onwards. But I would just encourage us to keep thinking about how the West consistently jeopardizes and often undermines developing countries' rights to self-determination through the progression and furtherance of their own agenda. So given that, let's look at what the UN did. The UN essentially took this to the General Assembly, where they had a vote on whether or not Palestinian territories should be partitioned, or whether there should be one unified federal state consisting of both Palestinians and Jews. So the vast majority of countries voted in favor of the partition. And this is because of arguments kind of pointed by both the Palestinian agencies and the Jewish agencies. So the arguments from Palestine was that there are pragmatic problems to the creation of a Jewish state, firstly. Secondly, self-determination is an inherent right of people. And thirdly, there are serious concerns that come with the emerging threads of Zionism that the Jewish population has brought with them. The arguments in favor of a Jewish homeland from Jewish people is that they needed unrestricted immigration for the establishment of a Jewish state. And so these two cases, again, are irreconcilable. The UN General Assembly decided that this issue fell largely outside of their jurisdiction and had handed it over to a special committee. The committee resolved that it's impossible to give both Palestinians and Jews what they want, and so partition was necessary. And so they took it to a vote. 25 members voted that partition would be the most appropriate course of action. Interestingly enough, the Union of South Africa at the time voted in favor of partition. The minority, and this is where the vast majority of Arab leagues fell, or rather Arab League nations, argued that the UN didn't have the authority or the legitimacy to make decisions that infringed on both the rights of Palestinian existence and the existence of a Jewish state. Long story short, at the end of 1948 is when the British officially withdrew from Palestine and when plans for the partition had already gone underway. Importantly, because the UN is a West-leaning institution, the better parts of Palestine were given to Israel to establish the Israeli state. And that's where we really have the emergence and the origins of the first Arab-Israeli war. A lot of things happened in that war, and I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty, but I think the impact of that war is particularly important because it meant that Israel kind of kept the area that it was allocated by the initial partition plan given by the UN. The West Bank was under the rule of Jordan, and the Gaza Strip was under the rule of Egypt. Again, Jordan and Egypt wanted an independent Palestinian state, and so they were just kind of occupiers and kind of guardians of that territory until a Palestinian governance could take place. We then have a mass kind of exodus of Jews away from Europe and back into Israel. And here you have like literally millions of Jews coming in and displacing Palestinian homes. And this carries on for the better half of a decade. So now we get to 1956, characterized importantly by the Suez Canal crisis. The Suez Canal crisis, in a nutshell, was when Egypt decided to nationalize a really strategic and economically important trade route. The conclusion of the crisis was basically that it was seen as a success for Arab countries, and it was kind of a flex on Israel. Straight after that, I think we had the biggest mass displacement of Arab refugees. And so the way that the international community kind of spoke about this problem was less like an issue of self-determination for Palestinian independence, and it was characterized more as an issue of a refugee crisis. So that's interesting in terms of how that issue was phrased. The third important historical development was the Six-Day War. So that's what happened in 1967. And here we really see the insidious nature of the Cold War really play out, because remember that the Soviet Union, or the USSR, had backed the Arab League and those forces, and the US had backed Israel. And so the USSR kind of told Egypt, look, Israel is planning an attack on you, get your troops in order, you have to be able to counteract that attack. Turns out that that wasn't super reliable information, but tensions had steadily increased in that time, right? So around the borders of Palestine, specifically on the Syrian border, there was massive militarization from Arab nations. And so Israel started becoming a little bit touchy, and they launched a preemptive attack. That attack was incredibly lethal and quite devastating to the Arab League military forces. For example, 90% of the air force of Egypt was taken out by Jewish forces. And so in just 132 hours, literally over 20,000 Arab lives had been lost and 800 Israelis had died. The impact of that crisis was quite wide-reaching, because it meant that Gaza and the West Bank, which were previously held by Jordan and Egypt and Jordan respectively, were handed over to Israel. This obviously was seen as a massive setback for Arab countries, which led them in 1967 to adopt the Khartoum Resolution, which is basically them saying that under no circumstances are they going to recognize the legitimacy of the Israeli state or engage in any negotiation process, because what's most important is to restore independence to Palestinians. In 1973, we have what is known as the Third Arab-Israeli War, or perhaps more commonly known as the Yom Kippur War. So Yom Kippur is a holy day in the Jewish faith, and this is where the Arab nations had planned a clandestine attack, so a secret attack on Israel. And while Arab nations technically lost the battle, I think it did a lot to restore hope in the Arab world. And that was quite an important watershed moment, because that's when Israel kind of realized that this constant back and forth was going to continue at an unsustainable rate, and they couldn't keep kind of governing their country in this way. And for Egypt especially, I think they had realized that it would be near impossible to defeat the Israeli military forces, especially given their intense backing. And so that led to negotiations in 1979, and these negotiations are characterized by the Camp David Accords, which is basically a meeting between the US, Israel, and Egypt, where those three parties kind of decided to settle things down, and there was a truce and a ceasefire negotiated between Israel and Egypt. This is strategically very important for Palestine because Egypt was not only the main initiator of aggression against Israel pre-1979, but it was also the most well-funded. And so obviously this led to the expulsion of Egypt from the Arab League, but it also led to major setbacks for the Palestinian people and their prospects of success and independence through resistance. That's where I'm going to stop, and I think I'm handing over to Madhia.
I think you're handing over to Zayd.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, that's me. Yeah. Okay, thank you, Shania. Yeah, guys, I'm Zayd, and I'm like the treasurer of the PSF at Stellenbosch. So yeah, I'll be talking about between 1977, the invasion of Lebanon, and the first Intifada. So in 1977, basically, the main question concerning the United Nations was around the Palestinian and Israeli conflict, and majority of the international members wanted to see the peace in Middle East and basic human rights for Palestinians, and they came up with 4 basic considerations, and these considerations were that the Middle East problem can only be solved once the rights of the Palestinian people have been given, the return of Palestinian people to their homes and self-determination, and the establishment of their own independent state within Palestine, and then participation of the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, and them as a representative of the Palestinian people on an equal footing with all other parties. And finally, the condemnation of basically Israel to withdraw completely, and well, basically for Israel to withdraw completely and unconditionally from all territories that have been occupied since 1947. And many international organizations and other countries supported these notions and rejected Israelis' policies of expropriation of land and practices within these occupied regions. And there were many disruptions and intense fightback from both sides, and there was a lot of tension in the area. And in 1981, a ceasefire was called, and a period of stability was basically held. And this 9 months of stability was broken when Israel invaded Lebanon with a declared intention of driving Palestinians out of zone 25 miles, which bordered on Israel. So, however, after declaring this, the real intention of invading Lebanon was to eliminate the PLO. And Israel subsequently moved its troops in Lebanon to Beirut, where the forces of the PLO held out for over 2 months. And They eventually withdrew from Beirut after a ceasefire had been arranged and they withdrew from this after a guarantee of safety was provided to the thousands of Palestinian civilians who would be left behind. And they moved basically the PLO moved their organization's headquarters to Tunisia. However, the Israeli forces still advanced into West Beirut, and 16th September, the Israeli army had established its control in most of West Beirut sector of the city and took up positions around the Palestinian refugee camps. And the following day, the Security Council actually condemned this excursion by the Israeli army into Beirut and the violation of the ceasefire agreement. And 17th September, the Security Council received reports that armed men had the previous evening entered the Sabra and Shatila Palestinian refugee camps in West Beirut and were engaging in a wholesale killing of the civilian population. And it was confirmed there was a large-scale massacre that had taken place in the refugee camps. Bodies of men, women, and children were found, some of them mutilated, and many of them apparently killed while trying to escape. Many homes had been blown up with the occupants still inside. So the events in Lebanon in the summer of 1982 once again highlighted the need of a settlement of the question of Palestine. And the international interest urgently finding some solution was again reflected in various proposals made at the time. The November 23rd, the Security Council adopted the resolution by which it requested the parties concerned immediately accept the ceasefire and invited them to settle their differences exclusively by peaceful terms. And in December, the chairman and executive committee of the PLO, Yasser Arafat, accompanied 3,000 armed elements and 1,000 militia embarked from Tripoli aboard Greek ships. And they had consultations with the members of the Security Council and agreed to request that the United Nations flag be flown over the evacuation ships as a humanitarian gesture. So, although the UN explicitly called out Israel on its war crimes and continuous occupation of violation of Palestinian human rights, nothing had changed. And at the end of 1987, the question of Palestine and that of Arab-Israeli conflict as a whole remained in the forefront of the international community's attention. And sorry. In early December 1987, the Palestinian problem entered into a new phase where a massive uprising, the Intifada of the Palestinian population, erupted early that month in the occupied Gaza Strip and spread to the rest of the occupied territory. The reason for the Intifada starting was when 4 Palestinians died and 9 others were injured after an IDF truck struck their vans at an army roadblock in the Gaza Strip. And the Palestinians believe these deaths were deliberately caused and popular protests were followed. The Israeli forces began to use live ammunition against the Palestinian protesters, which resulted in high casualties on the Palestinian side. Following these intense Gaza protests, the Palestinian popular uprising flared up in the West Bank and Jerusalem. To subdue and disperse the all-out Palestinian protest demonstration, the IDF special forces, police, and Jewish settlers used live ammunition and indiscriminate beatings of Palestinians, as well as other means of repression. Israeli occupation authorities, despite the worldwide condemnation of their practices in the occupied territory, persisted in the iron fist policy against the Palestinians. Methods used by the Israeli forces in the occupied West Bank and the Gaza Strip in dealing with a popular uprising resulted in mass injuries and heavy loss of life among the civilian Palestinian population, including children, women, and the elderly. The reliance of the Israeli military on certain types of tear gas in high concentrations was from the start of the Intifada the cause of numerous deaths and miscarriages among pregnant Palestinian women and deaths among children. Although in June 1988, an important statement was made by the PLO spokesman, Mr. Bassam Abu Sharif, who said that the key to Palestinian-Israeli settlement was through negotiations between the two parties to the conflict. He also expressed the PLO's readiness to talk with any party chosen by the Israeli side to represent it at such negotiations. And this is where I'll give over to Madhia, who will talk about these peace negotiations after the 90s and the Oslo Accords. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Madhia. I'm the secretary of the PSF, and I will be talking about the peace agreements of the 1990s. So basically, after all these decades of violence, the Palestinian Liberation Organization and Israel decided to secretly meet in Norway in 1992 to put an end to the violence. And this is mostly because even though the Palestinian Liberation Organization had asked for negotiations before, Israel saw them as a terrorist organization and hence did not go ahead with any sort of negotiations. However, since after these decades of violence, Israel had a lot of pressure from the international community. It went ahead with these negotiations in Norway. And this basically gave rise to the Oslo Accords, in which various things were discussed, including borders, governance, and peace. And there was a glimmer of hope that the situation would be resolved by these Oslo Accords. But unfortunately, they ultimately most people regard that they ultimately failed. During the period from 1990 to 2000, there was the fastest increase in Israeli settlement in illegal Israeli settlement. So just for some context, a decade ago, the United States President, Jimmy Carter, brokered a deal with Egypt and Israel. And this brought about some peace in the Middle East, but Palestine still didn't have the right to self-govern, and it remained like this for 10 years. So what happened with the Oslo Accords is in 1993, Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization signed the Oslo Accords. And there were two Oslo Accords that was signed, one in 1993 and one in 1995. In the first one, both states were, there was agreement that they recognized each other. So that was basically the first Oslo Accord. And after 5 years, the Palestinian Authority, after 5 years, there was going to be talks about establishing Palestinian Authority. So now I'm just going to share my screen quickly to show what was the Oslo Accords in 1995, the second Oslo Accord. I'm sorry, it's just taking a while. Okay, can everyone see my screen? I hope everyone can see my screen.
Can.
Okay, good. Okay, so as you can see over here, this was this picture over here. This was the 1995, the second Oslo Accord. And if you look at the green parts, those parts were going to be were agreed to be under the control of the PLO. The gray parts were to be under the control of a joint control. And the blue parts of the West Bank were going to be under Israeli control. So as you can see, the West Bank, still the majority of the West Bank is under Israeli control. All right. Now the issue with this is that the areas that were under joint control, despite the fact that the Palestinian administration was in charge of education, health, and economy, the Israelis would still have full control of the external security, meaning that they had the right to enter at any time, to detain an individual, or sometimes to conduct an extrajudicial execution. The Oslo Accords were also very controversial for many Israelis and Palestinians. Right-wing Israelis considered the PLA as a terrorist organization, despite the fact that the PLA had renounced violence. And a lot of Israeli settlers feared eviction from the land that they had illegally settled in, as they regarded it as their biblical right. And this is despite the fact that the UN's position was that Israeli settlements were a violation of international law. Also, many Palestinians reasoned that the Oslo Accords were a compromise that could lead to peace. But there were also other political parties outside of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, such as Hamas, which opposed the Accords and warned that a two-state solution would betray the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to the land taken from them. So the Oslo Accords had skeptics on both sides, and the numbers grew because the process failed to deliver on its promise. Many believe that Israel had benefited the most from the negotiations in 1993. And just as an illustration, between 1993 and 2000, the Israeli population growth in the West Bank reached the fastest pace of growth ever. Decades after Arafat and Rabin, the president of Israel at the time, shook hands on the White House lawn, the dreams of a Palestinian state still remains elusive. And that's the Oslo Accords and the 1990s process for peace. I think I'll be passing on to Kwanda now.
Yes.
Is it not video?
Yes.
Is it not the video now?
Oh, okay.
Yes.
I'm not sure.
Awesome. Okay. Hello everybody again. Just allow me a moment to share my screen. So now we are going to show you guys a video made by Palestinians, by Palestinian organization who have made multiple educational videos and done a lot of research within Palestine. This because as much as we do want to help the Palestinian people advocate for their rights and their human rights and the rights to self-determination, ultimately with any protest action or advocacy, it is always best to hear from the people affected because they understand their needs and their wants and their experience best. So we're going to start off with a video visualizing the occupied Jerusalem, the denial of residency restriction on movement and discrimination in Jerusalem. Please understand that this is just one case study. There is great diversity within Palestine, areas in which the occupation and discrimination and segregation, violations of human rights are much worse and relatively less obvious as well. So it really is something that people should look into and learn from. Anyway, yeah, I'm going to press play now. Hello? Sorry, my Wi-Fi just cut out. Let me just... Okay. Guys, I am so sorry. My Wi-Fi is making things a bit difficult at the moment. Can everybody see my screen?
Fadeelah, I think I do have the video, so can I share it?
Sure.
Because I won't be streaming it. I downloaded it. I think it will.
Oh, I think it's playing now.
Fadeelah, there's no audio.
No audio. The audio is in Arabic, so I'm not sure if it's needed. Should I press play, or should you just want to screen share from your side?
No, you can continue. I just realized that it's a different video, but from Palestine, it's a different perspective. So, since it's in Arabic, you can share it. Just read.
Okay. Just to give a bit of context into the struggles discussed in this video, Jerusalem is what could be considered behind the Green Line. So in the picture Madhia showed earlier, indicating the current partition of land usage, there are areas that we mentioned that are under quote-unquote joint control by Israel and Palestinian control. Under these areas of joint control and behind the Green Line, there are provisions of resources separate between Palestinians and Jews. Palestinians and Israelis. Israelis have different roads that they use. They are segregated residentially. Their natural resources, they have access to natural resources. Palestinian villages and communities are cut off from natural resources grids such as water lines and electricity lines, and suffer in terms of their social services such as education and healthcare, because for one thing they are unable to travel on certain roads to get to these education sectors, and the other thing is that the internal development within those villages and communities is limited and actively sort of sought after by Israeli governments, who demand the demolishing of any sort of building or development, even in land that is Palestinian. All of the land is Palestinian, but even in designated Palestinian villages. So they actively restrict the development of these Palestinian communities. And it is hard not to view these tactics and sort of things as active colonial oppression, akin to apartheid oppression. Yeah, sorry, that's all.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone, for attending. So right now, I'm not sure if I should play one last video for 5 minutes and then we move to a Q&A. I think these Palestinian voices, they're important because it gives us a glance as to what is transpiring currently there in Palestine, and it becomes first-hand, kind of information, not something that has been narrated. So I'm not sure, just a thumbs up if maybe you like the idea, or we can just move to a Q&A if there are any questions about what has been presented. Okay. All right, so we can move to questions. Are there any questions about the presentation? Are there any things that you need clarity on regarding the conflict, or rather the incremental genocide upon the Palestinians, if we were to characterize it for what it is? Do you have any questions? Yes, I see a hand. Lebo, you may.
I just wanted to ask, I know that obviously we should take the time to do our own research on finding out resources and organizations that actually do help Palestinians and do solve that problem. So there's obviously that avenue of going about social advocacy and social justice. But in terms of the few times where we are going to hold talk shops and stuff like that, what would be the most appropriate way of continuing the conversation from the point where we are now?
Fadeelah, you raised your hand. Do you want to venture in answer to that question? Thank you so much, Lebo, for the question. It's an important question.
Yeah, so once the historical context is sort of explained in terms of you moving the advocacy branch forward, as Kwanda mentioned, it's always important to focus on Palestinian voices because they understand the issues best, and also they know what currently is the issues that they want to focus on. So recently, or something that was mentioned earlier, is the diversity of the Palestinian nation and their wants and their goals. Something that created contention during the Oslo Accords, I believe, when the PLO was in power, and even now the PLO remains in power despite the fact that the election was last made in the 2000s. However, many Palestinians don't feel sufficiently recognized by the PLO because they don't acknowledge the need for the right of return of refugees, which is a big point for Palestinians. So I would say that in terms of moving forwards, focus on an area. There are so many areas in which the post needs to move forward, but focus on areas and be specific in how you want to in like that area. So, for example, in the right of return sort of area, there is always the argument that, well, Palestinians have already found new homes, when in fact that is not the case. There are Palestinian refugees all over the world, an entirely huge diaspora who are living under abysmal conditions, and this is recorded by the UN. I apologize, I live on a very busy road. And so getting specific information about specific areas in which the Palestinian rights are being abused, and then moving that needle forward. Because sort of the general understanding tends to, while it does bring about consciousness, there's a bit less room for direct advocacy. Whereas if you do focus on right of return, you can lobby with, for example, our Minister of International Relations, which, fun fact, is coming to Stellenbosch tomorrow evening, and ask, hey, what are you doing to ensure that Palestinians do get the right of return in any peace talks? What are you doing to ensure that Palestinian refugees' rights are being protected at all cost? Another example of a specific area that you can focus on is the continued focus within policy regarding aid and funding for Palestinian organizations, which in the last 20 or 30 years, the US and other Western entities have sort of included the stipulation now in financial aid to say that they won't support any Palestinian organization which, quote unquote, connects or interacts with terrorist organizations, which is a problematic clause. First of all, because who decides what is a terrorist organization? Biased organizations, committees, etc., such as NGO Watch and the US itself, as well as Israel, who literally identifies PLO and other political parties as terrorist organizations. Community organizations such as healthcare focused organizations, etc., are also viewed as terrorist organizations under regular Western sort of policy currently, because they do interact with Hamas in order to gain access to the Gaza Strip and get their resources through there. It is impossible to not look at this and see the inherent attempt by the West and the US to limit funding. So yeah, how can you get in contact with these voices? Or the online social groups and such where we can continue and forward their message and stance? So BDSSA is recently sort of working with a lot of SA organizations to sort of connect the South African bodies, and through BDS, we've gotten a lot of contact with Palestinian organizations, such as hearing about Badil and Adamir and all of these other things. There is a list of active Palestinian humanitarian organizations somewhere that I can find and send in the chat when I'm done. Yeah, it is available online, and usually they have an email address. They are very willing to interact and provide contact. There's also a few Palestinians on social media, both within Palestine and among the diaspora, who are very active and willing to engage with Palestinian advocacy organizations or groups and attend speaking things, etc.
Thank you so much. Just one last question from my side. We can't have a branch of the society on Tygerberg at the moment. It seems there've been a few requests and so forth. So just moving forward, how as Tygerberg can we sort of like, join in on whatever you guys are planning, sort of lend our voices, lend our time, lend our skills, or just to show support. We don't know if like membership would still be a possibility for some of our students, or could we just be there in an honorary supportive capacity?
Membership is definitely an availability. In fact, you can run for election to be a part of the exec, which elections are coming up next week. Yeah, societies, while there is like different variations of societies on Tygerberg and Stellenbosch, societies are not limited to a particular campus. You can join SUPSF. I think the tricky part is just ensuring that the society exec is held accountable to sort of provide access to events to Tygerberg student members. Unfortunately, we were unable in May to organize shuttles from Tygerberg into the protest in SU just due to the fast nature of how everything went down. But it's more than possible for you to just join the society or also even lead the society. And if you do want a separate entity on Tygerberg, you don't need to go through the formal route of registering a society. You could always just organize various actions in your free time, or join up with larger, previously established Palestinian organizations, Palestinian advocacy organizations in South Africa.
Yes, thank you so much. I think Fadeelah has, covered has answered the questions asked very comprehensively. I'm not sure if there are any other questions or things that you still need clarity on. If that's not the case, we would like to extend our fervent gratitude for dedicating your time to this. It means a lot, not only to us, but to the bigger picture, which is the quest to liberate Palestine, and the quest to have Palestinian voices represented in conversations, in discourses of human rights and human rights violations. So thank you so much for taking your time to be a part of this. It means a lot, and we hope that it won't end here, and that even within your sphere of influence, you will continue spreading the message, tweeting about Palestine, the liberation of Palestine, and also informing yourself about, how the conflict evolved over time, because I understand that it may have been too much to digest at this short time, but I can suggest a book by Ilan Pape. What's the name of this book? But it has to do with ethnic cleansing. If you can search Ilan Pape ethnic cleansing, you can get the book. Ilan Pape is in the way I've spelled it today in the chat box. So yeah, let's keep on spreading the word and join other human rights societies, because it is very much important that we also support other movements, the quest for queer rights, and the fighting against the discrimination of other groups, of other minority groups in our society. So we should keep in mind, and recently you also have Afghanistan now, the Taliban taking over. So it is very much important for us to unite all these human rights violations and forge a united front in tackling them. Thank you so much for your time.
Sorry, Kwanda, just before you go, something you said, I have one more comment just to add. There is also like this narrative that has been perpetuated by Israel and by the West, that Palestine is not inclusive, that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, etc. And that Palestinians want to kill queer people and don't respect women's rights. And I, again, would just like to point out the diversity of Palestinian organizations and the ignorance of the Palestinians' right to sort of fight for themselves. Because the Palestinian organizations that are moving forward the progressive agenda within Palestine are given no attention, are consistently ignored. And some of the organizations are on that list. I also just want to bring special attention to ALCOS, which is a queer body representation in Palestine. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate the talk. We've all learned quite a lot. We've got we're more well equipped in terms of our knowledge and the way to go forward. We truly appreciate it. Hopefully everyone will still be in contact and we can have more collaborations and such going forward. Thank you so much once again. We really do appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you everybody for showing up. Bye.